think we're... Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm so accustomed to saying Shabbat Shalom, but we'll wait until tomorrow for that. I'm very pleased that you're here, and some of us also were earlier today at the Holocaust Museum Houston Guardian of the Spirit Luncheon. It's been a full week appreciating our past, our history, but also our obligation and commitment to the present and the future. And given the rise of anti-Semitism in the world today, I can't think of any better opportunity than tonight to add to our curriculum of learning about the Holocaust and all of its implications, not only for what we can understand about history and how it's come down to us, but our obligation today for the sake of our present and certainly the future of our children and our children's children. I'm very grateful for the adult education program at Congregation Beth Israel. Our entire lifelong learning program under the leadership of David Scott has really helped us to blossom and flourish as Jewish learners. We're commanded in the Torah to learn, and I don't think we have failed in any regard with respect to learning. So I want to thank you too for taking the invitation to be here tonight and to learn with our scholar and actually a friend that we've known each other for some time before I left Dallas to return to Houston. But without further ado, I also want to appreciate Ed Septimus. Dr. Septimus is the chair of our Adult Education Committee and is so committed to the highest level of learning and scholarship that we can bring to Congregation Beth Israel. So Ed, why don't you come up and we can appreciate you for all that you do for the congregation and for all of us. And welcome and enjoy the evening.
It's quite a reception, but thank you very much for coming tonight. I just wanted to highlight what we're doing in adult education. You know, we started this year with a wonderful symposium on reproductive justice. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a scholar in residence, the president of HUC, Dr. Arnold Rayfield, and tonight we have a wonderful scholar that's going to talk to us a little bit about the book that a beautiful book that he's written. But I just want to give you some snapshots of what's coming up. So take your electronic calendars out. This weekend, I think you all know we have Shir Shabbat with Dan Nichols. It's going to be a very full weekend, Friday night, Torah study on Saturday morning, then a wonderful Havdalah and storytelling that'll take place at 7:30. Then on Tuesday, this isn't enough, we have the Freelander Forum. It's going to bring wonderful author, Dr. Wendy Mogul, who talks about parenting and how you talk to children. I kind of want her to talk a little bit how you talk to grandchildren. Have you all had that problem? Yep. So that's a great night. You don't want to miss that. And then we're going to have Thanksgiving this year. And then after Thanksgiving, I just want to highlight 2 events in December. The first is our phenomenal movie night. If you've never been to a movie night at Beth Israel, you need to come. We have goodies, we have popcorn, we have goobers, and all kinds of candy that you probably remember when you used to go to the movies. This particular movie, we're going Me and the Colonel. It's a gem of a movie. It was in the 1950s with Danny Kaye. It's sort of a comedy, kind of historical kind of movie. In that, Danny Kaye actually won a Golden Globe Award for Best Actor in a motion picture, musical, or comedy. It takes place in Paris during World War II and his relationship with one of the Nazi generals. And then Rabbi Lyon mentioned about anti-Semitism. On December 8th, one of the programs in collaboration with our Social Justice Committee, we'll have a program starting at 6 p.m. on anti-Semitism. It's also co-sponsored by the ADL. So that's just what's coming up for the rest of this year, and we have a great program starting in January. And for those of you who have ideas for programs for the following season, see me or let me know. Did you have a question? What night is the movie night? Movie night's Thursday, December the 1st. It's probably going to be about 6:30. There'll be some light dinner and then the popcorn and the goobers. But the movie is also a terrific movie. It's one that a lot of people don't know about, but it got a lot of accolades. And so we'll have a little discussion after the movie. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Scott, who will introduce our scholar, and the logistics for tonight. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you to our Adult Education Committee. Thank you for all that you do. And please do come Tuesday night for the Paula and Alfred Friedlander Forum on how to speak to our children and grandchildren. It should be really illuminating and very important. On November 9th and 10th, 1938, one of the largest pogroms in history took place against the Jewish people, which became known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Shops were destroyed, businesses were ruined, and this watershed event marked the beginning of the Holocaust of World War II. 6 million Jews were murdered along with millions more, and the stories of our people that emerged from that terrible time are still being unearthed and discovered. Tonight we will learn about a new story that many of us never knew existed. I'm grateful to Ed and the Adult Education Committee of the Temple, and I'm particularly grateful tonight to Ed Hirsch, who is the program's chair for tonight's event. Ed, would you please stand and be recognized? Thank you. Bryan Mark Rigg is the author of Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, which won the William E. Colby Award for Military History, was featured on NBC TV's Dateline, and has been translated into 11 languages. He's also the author of Rescued from the Reich, Lives of Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, The Rabbi Saved by Hitler's Soldiers, and his most recent work, Flamethrower, a nonfiction military history book that documents Herschel Woody Williams' Medal of Honor process. Bryan completed his undergraduate studies at Yale University in 1996, receiving honors in history and the prestigious Henry Fellowship to conduct graduate studies at Cambridge University in England, where he completed his master's in 1997 and his PhD in 2002. Bryan has served as a volunteer in the Israeli Army, the IDF, and an officer in the United States Marine Corps. He has served on the boards of the Iwo Jima American Association and the Dallas Holocaust Museum, and he's currently serving on the American Jewish Committee Board in Dallas. Bryan also runs his own financial advisory firm, Rigg Wealth Management. Please join me in welcoming Bryan Mark Rigg to the Bima this evening.
If I don't use the microphone, can everybody hear me? Yes. If you have any problems, let me know and I'll go to the microphone. But I always feel like I need to be a rabbi or a minister or whatnot when I'm behind the pulpit, and I like to use my hands and move around. Well, Ed, thanks so much for organizing this, my friend, and putting this together. David, thank you for that warm introduction. Rabbi Lyon, so good to see you again and to be in your community. Nice meeting several of the people in the audience, Charles, and Peter, and Harriet. Thank you, and many others. Don, thank you so much for coming. Before I go into this history, that was a 10-year odyssey and was an obsession, if you will, as an undergrad at Yale and as a graduate student at Cambridge, I'd like to give a little context on my person, because when I hear that, my accolades at Yale University and Cambridge and so on are being put out there, I want to give it some context, because I was probably one of the last people picked in the heavens when I was born in 1971 to go to Yale, because I have the dubious honor of having failed first grade twice. I have what people call ADHD and dyslexia, and my most recent book, which is here, it's called Conquering Learning Disabilities, documents this. But when I was a child, it wasn't called ADHD or dyslexia. The Child Study Center in Fort Worth diagnosed me with MBD, minimal brain damage, and HLD, hyperkinesis learning disabled. I also had a horrible speech impediment, was plagued with malapropisms. Weather would become wither, and bad would become bug, and so on. My B's and D's got mixed up all the time, so I was continually calling my father bad. And I got my T's and F's mixed up all the time, so when I was playing with my trucks around my family's friends, it made for interesting conversation. And one time I had a cousin over, and my grandmother used to always tuck me into bed, so when I asked her to tuck me into bed, it was also interesting later on when my mom said, no, he's not precocious, he just has a lot of issues. So, yeah. Thank you. So I do need to use this, right, David? Okay. Hey, no problem. So once I failed first grade for the second time, and my mom started having a nightmare of seeing her 20-year-old son driving himself to his own sixth grade graduation, she realized she needed to take some serious action. So she looked all over the place, and she eventually found a wonderful school at TCU called Starpoint. And this school came into being in the 1960s when the Neely family, a very prominent family, had a grandson that back then when you had learning disabilities, you were just kicked out of school. So after the third time of this kid being kicked out, they developed their own school and did a lab school at TCU to focus on kids with severe learning disabilities. And so it had been in existence for 10 years. And it was like a reverse application process. You had to prove you were a disaster. Well, since I met all the requirements, I was accepted. And when I first went there, I was extremely demoralized. Since the school that I went to when I was a kid was the church that my family went to, every Wednesday night, Sunday morning, Sunday night, I was continually reminded of my failures. Moron Rigg, idiot Rigg, freak Rigg. These were my monikers, after my name, so to speak. So when I went to the school, I was very shy. The school that I had gone to also did licks. So I got the living daylights beaten out of me. And my dad, being a strong military Korean War vet, every time I got licks at home, at school, got licks at home. So when I went to this new school, I thought, once again, I'm going to have failure and I'm going to be punished. And I was, for all intents and purposes, I was probably suffering a little bit from PTSD. So they put me into this school, had a wonderful teacher, Mary Stewart. And she gave me a big hug after she heard my story. And she said, Bryan, you're not learning disabled. You're learning different. You're not a moron. You're not a freak. You're just different. And I'm here to help you find your strengths. And you'll see in the book, I have my files. I was 8 years old and I couldn't do the alphabet. And in 1 year, by the time I was 9, she had me reading Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway. And she had me doing algebra and geometry. And I remember her giving me a big hug at the end of that year. She's like, Bryan, look at this. All those kids are calling you a freak and abnormal. You now are learning at a higher level than they are. Don't let people define you. You define yourself. Later on, when I graduated from Yale, she was there. And my book is dedicated to her. She's proofread it and so on. And I bring that up to give you context of the Cambridge and Yale. This is to show you it's a long journey. Also to kind of tell you that early on I started thinking about, persecution, if you will, or going after the other starts early. So later on when I started seeing how the Nazis were treating children and conditioning a whole generation, we got to be very careful about focusing on, we're one race, the human race, and focusing on teaching our children early on about kindness. So that's kind of how I wrap that segment of my history into this. Another part you probably need to know about me is that I didn't know about my own Jewish background until I was 21. The Iron Curtain came down, and all of a sudden all the cities that my families had come from on my German side were now open to me, because it was in Saxony, Lower Saxony, Sachsen-Anhalt, Sachsen, and then you had places in Prussia, which now are, of course, Poland, and in Pomeranian, which is Poland and now part of Germany. So I was able to go over there and start doing some research on my family's background, which I was always interested in. And I wasn't necessarily expecting to find Jews in the family branches, but when I went over there, I started finding all these Jews along my grandmother's line. And I didn't really know what that meant. I mean, Jews to me, I had a vision of an old white guy coming off a mountain with 2 rocks in his hands. What I learned about Judaism in Vacation Bible School when I was raised as a Christian. So I came back to Yale to start my sophomore year when I found out all about this, about my past. And I sat down at the Hillel, and there was a ultra-Orthodox rabbi there from Or Sameach, from Israel, Rabbi Kasnet. And he took all these documents that I had, because I had death certificates, birth certificates, marriage certificates of several hundred of my family. And he started, putting it in line. All of a sudden he goes, Baruch Hashem, you're a Jew. And I said, what does that mean? I thought I was a wasp. He says, well, by halacha, it comes down through your mother's line. Welcome to the tribe. And so he gave me a book called To Be a Jew by Rabbi Donnan. And then I also got a book called As a Driven Leaf by Milton Steinberg. And then about a year later, I got a scholarship from Rabbi Kassanet to go to Or Sameach in Israel and study in a yeshiva and learn about my yikus, my Yiddishkeit. So that was one thing that also kind of helped you understand my psychology here, is I was starting to think, okay, what would happen to my family had we remained in Germany? Why don't I know about this? Why is there anti-Semitism? And then to go into an interesting, segue into how did I get involved with Hitler's Jewish soldiers? Well, this same summer that I found out about my own Jewish background, I was studying in Berlin to learn the language of my ancestors as well. And I asked one of my teachers, after about a month of being there, hey, what can really help me get my German up to speed? I hadn't gone back to the towns where my family was from yet, and I wanted to get it up to speed more before I started doing my research. He says, well, people usually like to go to plays and go to movies. What are you interested in? And I said, well, I've always been interested in World War II and the Holocaust. He's like, you got to go see the film Europa, Europa. In German, it's called Ich war Hitlerjungen Solomon. I was the Hitler Youth called Solomon. So I went to the theater in the middle of Berlin on the main drag, Kurfürstendamm, and bought my ticket and entered an empty auditorium. And while waiting for this film to begin, I hear the doors open up behind me, and I turn to see an old man walk in. And his eyes hadn't adjusted to the darkness. He was a little discombobulated with his surroundings, and he leaned up against the wall. And as soon as I saw that with my good Texas upbringing, I went up to him, asked him if I could help him find a seat. He was very appreciative, and then I sat him next to me. He quickly heard that my German was not very good, and so he began to speak fluent British English to me. And since we were the only ones in there, we weren't really worried about bothering anyone. And so during the film, he was giving me commentary left and right on it because he was a German veteran himself, and there's a lot of war scenes. At the end of this film, this very distinguished high school professor of physics was in tears. And I said, what do you think? He's like, well, it's very close to my own history. Would you like to go talk? And I said, sure. So we walked down the street to a bar where he told me his story until the early hours of the morning. Peter Milius, and I'll go forward a little bit, was his name. Oh, I've got to maybe turn this on. There we go. That's the cover of my first books. Yeah, so Peter Milius was his name. And when we went and he was telling me a story, he was of Jewish descent and served 4 years in the German armed forces, also called the Wehrmacht. And he told me about the fear he had of being of Jewish descent, how he worried about his half-Jewish mother. He also, and I later found out from his family, he had never talked about this, in Germany, what made the German military so phenomenal at the beginning is that they recruited whole groups of boys from their high schools. So they had grown up together. They knew each other. And the next crop that came the next year were in units that were often neighboring units of the older units. So when you were deployed in Russia, the guys to your left and right were in the school and from the communities you were from, and the guys you were with were kids you'd gone to school with since kindergarten. So his brother was in a neighboring unit. And during, they were on the siege of Leningrad, and during one of the battles, he was asked to come to identify his brother. He'd been killed with a whole bunch of other guys in an artillery barrage, and he was faced with taking a decapitated brother's head and putting it with the body. And he's telling me this, and I'm a 21-year-old kid, and he's confiding in me. And after this whole night of him telling me about his experiences once he got taken prisoner by the Russians and was 4 years in a Siberian prisoner war camp, and I told him, I will not forget you. Now, I didn't think I was going to be writing books and be in front of you now, 30 years later, but I knew I was going to do something to try to document this. So I came back to Yale to begin my sophomore year after this experience. And this is what started me kind of thinking about this, because I was thinking, man, what are the coincidences that a kid from Texas goes to Germany, sees a film about a Jew who served in the Nazi military, because that's what Europa Europa is about. Maybe I should back up. For those of you who have not seen it, it's on Netflix. Europa Europa is about Shlomo Perel, a German Jew who in 1936 escapes from Nazi Germany and goes to Poland. In 1939, when Germany invades Poland, he goes to Russia. In 1941, when Germany invades Russia, he has nowhere else to run to. He's taken prisoner outside the city of Minsk, and during his interrogation, he says he's a Volksdeutscher, an ethnic German, instead of a Jew. And he's accepted into the unit because they're wondering, how in the heck do you speak German so well? But he also speaks Polish and Russian. So he was their translator, dolmetscher, for 1 year. And he was in this combat unit for a year until his company commander, who was childish at the time, Captain von Munchau, decides to adopt him and sends him back to a Hitler Youth Prep School where he survived the war. So after that experience, ladies and gentlemen, I'm thinking, okay, what are the coincidences? Here, again, a kid from Texas goes to Germany, sees a film about a Jew who served in the Nazi military, only to sit next to a Wehrmacht veteran of Jewish descent, and then 1 month later I find out about my own Jewish background. So somebody telling me something. Also, I haven't been able to really verify this story, but my uncle John Little told me a story about my uncle that was in the Meuse-Argonne offensive of 1918, World War I, first generation German. And during one of the battles afterwards, I was in the Marine Corps. Our military were phenomenal, but we're kleptomaniacs. Wherever we go, we're taking medals and diaries and flags, especially from World War II. They were taking whole sea bags full of Nazi flags and medals and Lugers. Anybody who has a father or grandfather from that time period knows what I'm talking about. Well, my uncle was no different. And he was taking stuff off of dead Germans. One dead German he took a diary off of and had the same last name that he had, which is a very unique name, Barbie with a Y, not I-E. Those were the Huguenots. And no relationship to Klaus Barbie. Barbie, this is German, Barsch, coming from the fish, Y on the Rhine River. So anyway, brought it back over to my great-grandfather, and the story goes that he had found his cousin on the battlefield. And now when I find out that that German branch were the Jews, I'm thinking, how in the world do I have a cousin that was a Jew serving in World War I, but if he had survived, been thrown in the ovens? This also got me thinking, what's going on here? I got to learn more about this history, especially finding guys that were in the German military. So when I came back to Yale University and I started talking to very prominent professors, Paula Hyman, the head of the Judaic Studies, Henry Turner, one of the most famous German historians of America. I talked to Jeffrey Parker. None of them really believed I was going to find very much. Charles Dimmitz and so on. And they say, hey, you're a kid, you study some serious German history, quit chasing after some curious anomalies who will not add anything to our understanding. Well, then I asked them, have you ever looked into this? Do you know anybody who's looked into it? And when they always answered in the negative, all of a sudden that lesson that Mary Stewart gave me early on, that I need to go figure out stuff. Don't listen to other people if they tell you can't do it. I was a contrarian. I'm always going to be a contrarian. And that kicked in again, especially when they were looking down at their nose at me, because that childhood experience never left me. So I started looking into it. And by the end of my first year, I got a scholarship to return to Germany and live with Peter Milius and document his life more thoroughly. And he helped me start documenting people. Got very excited, and the next year I started doing independent studies about World War II, the Holocaust, German Jewish history. And by the end of this year, I had documented 7 living Wehrmacht veterans of Jewish descent. Now, I wanted to go over to Germany and interview them. And so I decided that I was going to take off a year between my junior and senior year, 1994 to 1995, and focus on these guys. Most of my professors at the time told me this was not a good idea. They were worried about me not coming back. I applied for a lot of scholarships from Yale. I got many of them, but it was only for a summer. But since, I've been very thrifty, my mom always says I take after my Scottish background, that I was able to spread a 3-month scholarship over 14 months. I took off a year. My goal in this year, was to interview at least 20 to 30 men of Jewish descent who served in the Nazi military, do research in the archives, and make sure my German was fluent and I could speak it like English. And learning German, learning a new language, now I really suddenly saw why I have such problems with ADHD and dyslexia. And one side note, ladies and gentlemen, some of the highest levels of ADHD and dyslexia is in the Jewish community. And I have all the research and history for that in my book, Conquering Learning Disabilities. The only other community that has the same levels, Native Americans. And I have a whole theory for that, but that's for another whole discussion. But learning the language is very difficult. But that was my goal. Make the German fluent, do research in the archives, interview 30 guys. In the first month alone, I interviewed over 30. It was a snowball effect. And before I knew it, by the end of this year, I had interviewed 200 men of Jewish descent who had served in the Nazi military and had collected over 10,000 pages of documents. I came back to my doubting Thomas professor, Henry Turner, and I went up to his office. I had collected, I still can't believe as a 22, 23-year-old kid I'm doing this. I had 7 original documents signed by Hitler. I had 10 Lugers. I had over 1,000 medals. And then I had all these documents. And I brought them and I dumped a lot of the most important ones in front of my professor. And I was like, now will you be my senior essay advisor? He's like, okay, I'll do it. I had a document that was really fascinating. One of Hitler's adjutants was still alive, Wolters, and I got to interview him. He gave me a list of 77 high-ranking officers of Jewish descent who Hitler Aryanized. And I'll get to that here in a second. But this was a treasure trove. I mean, there was 2, 3, 4-star generals on this list. I also interviewed Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge. If you haven't seen the movie Downfall, I recommend you to see it. That movie is based on her book. I interviewed the guy who carried Hitler out after he blew his brains out and dumped it in a crater, Otto Gunsche. These are the type of people I'm meeting as a 22, 23-year-old. You know, one thing I learned with my ADHD, I just got to have a lot of chutzpah. Just get out there and do it. You know, so I came back, wrote my senior essay, got the Henry Fellowship, and then I got to go over to Cambridge to conduct more studies on this subject matter. And I had the honor to study under the famous European historian, Jonathan Steinberg. And guess who his father was? Milton Steinberg, the famous rabbi, and one of the first books that was given to me, As a Driven Leaf, which if you read that book, it's all about identity, especially Jewish identity. So a lot of a lot of destiny aspects were going on here. So I'm with Jonathan Steinberg, incredible mentor, incredible support. And during this year, I conducted more and more interviews. And by the end of it all, I have done now total 450 interviews with German veterans of Jewish descent who served in the Nazi military. I've collected over 30,000 pages of documents, and I have over 500 hours of video with all these men. The youngest one was 72. The oldest one was 104. And for those of you who are in the military world, I got to interview Ernst Junger at 102. One guy at 104 actually picked me up in his car. That was an interesting story. But now, I guess, to tell you some interesting story. Here's an example of what I had to do to get my stories. I played football at Yale University. That was about 25, 30 pounds ago. And I still had a lot of my football weight on back then. So I carried my studio everywhere I went. I had a survival mountain backpack that I had converted to my carrying studio, if you will. I had a tripod, a radio, a printer, a computer, a camera, cassette tapes, audio tapes, extra books, some food. And sometimes it would be between the lowest end, 40 pounds. What I would sometimes do tours be about 80 pounds. It's kind of like what I was carrying when I was in the Marine Corps. And I would go all around Germany, Austria, and as soon as I found somebody, I would throw up my studio, save their story before they would take it to the grave. So the fun of the story, just kind of tell you some of the stuff that I had to go through. One guy I talked to was Alexander Stolberg. He wrote The Verdammte Pflicht, or The Bounded Duty. It's actually been translated in English. It's a very good read. He was the adjutant to Erich von Manstein, the famous field marshal, probably the most brilliant military commander of World War II. But Erich von Manstein was not born von Manstein. He was born von Lewinsky. Now, no relationship to Monica that I know of, but he did have rumors of having Jewish background.
And so I call up Alexander Stahlberg because I documented that his adjutant had Jewish background, and he verified that. And I wanted to go talk and interview him. And he said, well, son, if you're going to talk to me, you better hurry up. He was in his mid-90s. He's like, I got one foot on in the grave and one on a banana peel. If you're going to do it, you better do it now. I'm like, okay, sir, I'll get up there as soon as I can. Well, and I had a mountain bike that I would bike all around cities. I would take the Ural Pass and go around to the different cities. But once I got there, I found that I could save money and bike and then get to the interviews quicker by biking in the cities instead of using the streetcars and taxis and buses and so on. And I carried a sleeping bag because quite often I would sleep in parks and whatnot to save money. Then I would freshen up in a local public hotel and then go do my interviews. You know, blessed are the young, huh? So Alexander Stahlberg, I tell him I'm going to get there as soon as I can. I look on a map where he's at. He's living in a castle in Gartow in northern Germany, and the closest train link to him is from Berlin. I have to go up to Wittenberg, and from Wittenberg I have to bike about 45, 50 miles. Some of them very rural roads, but I'm like, okay, he's got one foot in the grave, one on the banana peel. I got to get up there as soon as I can. So I get up. I think my dates are right. It's December 3rd, 1994. I go up there. I bike all day. The sun goes down around 4 o'clock in northern Germany. And I turn on my lights, and I'm on some dirt roads. And one road was really bumpy, and I didn't see a pothole. And it literally flipped me over my bike. And I had that 40-pound backpack, hit the dirt, face, and so on. And I roll over, and I look at the moon. And I'm thinking, what am I doing? Because I had no idea I was going to document, serious history. I just wanted to have a good senior essay and enter, a senior essay into the history pool there at Yale and end my Yale career with dignity and respect. Well, I turned over. I'm tasting blood in my lip. I look in the moon. I'm like, what am I doing? But then I thought to myself, okay, he's almost dead. I got to get up. I got to interview him before he dies. And, and I had those doubting Thomases in my ear. I'm like, no, there's something more here. Because I'd already done now like 60 or 70 interviews by December. I was only hoping to do 20 to 30. And this guy was going to help me document a field marshal, a 5-star general. So I get with Alexander Stahlberg. When I get to the castle, and he comes out, he has the old penchant of a Prussian officer with a tweed jacket, bow tie. He's in a castle, literally. I walk through the gates, and there's service quarters here. They're now apartments and whatnot, but there was a fountain, and he lived in the big, mansion in the back. He walks out on the stairs. He sees me. He's like, oh, my goodness, you probably want to take a shower, young man. I'm like, yes, sir, that'd be nice. So I did take a shower and then cleaned up, and then we had a nice dinner, and then we talked all night. And then, after we had our brandy, he took me to this big room where he had all his documents. He had the actual battle plans of what Manstein was doing when Stalingrad collapsed and the Russians were pushing through the Ukraine, or too close to the Ukraine, and when they did a soft middle and then enveloped a couple 100,000 Russians and slaughtered them. I got the map from this guy, and he's showing me all this, and 3 days later I leave, and my backpack's about 80 pounds. I was the first guy really to interview him this way. And he was supporting me, got me with Richard von Weizsäcker, interview with him. Got me to Helmut Schmidt, the former chancellor of Germany, who had a Jewish grandfather and served in the Luftwaffe. My professor at Cambridge called me the sorcerer's apprentice. Once I called up all the powers, I couldn't stop it. Sure enough, after I interviewed Alexander Stahlberg, he died about a month later. Not because of the interview, but he was just a man in frail health, and this was just a sense of urgency I had, an example of what I had to do to get the documents that I did. So before I go into some of the historical things that I want to go into, when I use terms tonight, ladies and gentlemen, like Aryan or half-Jew or quarter-Jew, please put in your mind's eyes these terms in quotation marks. They're Nazi definitions. But without having these definitions, we don't understand the reality of the time period. So we have to use the terminology from back then to understand how these people were affected. But they are Nazi terms, and in my book, you will see they were quite often either italicized or in quotation marks. One thing that I told you that one of my professors, Henry Turner, said, he said, you're not going to find anybody of significance. Quit chasing after curious anomalies. There's nobody of significance. Well, what I started finding is that these people were at the highest levels of the Third Reich. And this is what's shocking. First person I'd like to tell you about is Erhard Milch. He was a field marshal, 5-star general, half Jew. He's a very interesting case study, and he's a case study of what many mothers did, what happened to his family. She was successful, most were not. And what happened is when the Nazi laws started coming out, which I'll be discussing here momentarily, the mother of Erhard Milch went to Goering and a lot of the SS bureaucrats and said, hey, my Jewish husband, Anton Milch, is not the father of my children. It's my Aryan lover, who happens to be my uncle, and by the way, he's dead. They did a lot of studies of his hair, of his body, his five siblings, and sure enough, a few months later, he was declared an honorary Aryan. He was für deutschblutig erklärt, for German blood declared. And, this guy was brilliant. He ran the Lufthansa in the 1920s. He organized the Luftwaffe like nobody else could. The success that the Luftwaffe had with the machines that they were building at that time was due to his genius and the way that they survived in Norway and saved the campaign, the Luftwaffe there. And then, of course, the screeching Stukas, the Messerschmitt 109, the prototypes for the Messerschmitt 262 jet. All this guy, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And what we see here with him that, in Nazi Germany, Jewish ancestry was horrible, but incest was okay. Shows you the absurdity of these laws. Next guy, you do not know him, but you should know him. This man is one of the most brilliant military minds I've ever studied, and I got his diaries and letters from the family. Helmut Wilberg, he was a General der Flieger, basically a 4-star general at the end of it all. That was a 3-star, but when he died, he got promoted to Generaloberst. This guy developed the operational concept that we call blitzkrieg. This guy is the father of blitzkrieg. In World War I, he organized planes, tanks, artillery, and infantry in combined arms in attacks in 1917 and 1918. He was the first guy to put radios in planes in World War I to communicate with the troops. The Russians and the French weren't even doing that by World War II. He wrote a protocol in the 20s and the 30s called Regulation 16, which was all about maneuver warfare and what the Allies later termed blitzkrieg, which we call blitzkrieg now, and this was his entire creation. He was also in charge of the entire Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War, where the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht cut their teeth on how to fight. In 1911, he died in a plane crash. He lost 9 relatives in Auschwitz. And look at this, as a military, look at this rack. I won't go through all the medals, but for you military types, he has Bronze Star, Silver Star, Navy Cross, Distinguished Service Cross, and 2 medals of honor, 2 Ritterkreuz. This guy was one of the most successful and brilliant admirals of the German Navy. Many people know about Battleship Bismarck and Battleship, Gneisenau and Tirpitz and Deutschland. This guy sank more tonnage in those 4 battleships by a factor of almost 3 times. What was he? He was what the people call Q ships, or auxiliary cruiser captains. These were ships that masqueraded around the high seas as merchant marine vessels, and when they get close to the enemy, they would drop their hidden doors, revealing their cannons, and tell the enemy either surrender or we'll blow you out of the water. He captured or sank almost 200,000 metric tons of shipping, 24 ships that he captured or sank. He was awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross, basically 2 medals of honor, and he kept his ship, for you guys that are in Navy, maritime studies, if you like that stuff, which I do as a Marine, he kept his ship afloat without needing to meet into a port for 640 days because he was cannibalizing all the ships that he was capturing. Brilliant mind. While he's out, this quarter Jew, as he's out doing all this, his Jewish wife and mother-in-law commit suicide in Hamburg. He ended up at the end of the war being in charge of the fleet in the Baltic, helped all the Prussians who were escaping from the Russians, and he became the first four-star admiral in NATO, working with Helmut Schmidt, especially in the famous flood in the 1950s in Hamburg. And he basically redid the whole and built it up from scratch, the German Navy that we know of today, the Bundesmarine. Okay. So now, I know my audience. I don't really have to go into Jewish law, but you have to know Jewish law to understand this history. And then you have to know the Nazi racial laws to understand what I'm about to tell you. Now, to let you know that I know about halacha, of course, a Jew is born of a Jewish mother or who properly converts to Judaism. If you use halacha to understand this history, it becomes very confusing. Let's go to the 3 case studies I just gave you. Erhard Milch had a Jewish father. So according to halacha, he would not be considered a Jew according to most Jews in the world. But you look at Helmut Wilberg, his mother was Jewish. So by halacha, he's considered a Jew. And Roga, Bernhard Roga, who I just told you about, the admiral, his mother's mother was Jewish. So if you use halacha to understand this history, then you have a lot of Jews who served in the Nazi military. But to truly, and you can see the confusion that can happen when you start using your own definitions of reality to try to interpret history. But to understand this history more thoroughly, you have to have a general understanding of the Nazi racial laws, the Nuremberg laws from 1935. For the Nazis, a Jew was a person who had more than 2 Jewish grandparents, so it was more than 50%, or who practiced the Jewish religion. A Aryan, quote-unquote Aryan, had to have 4 Germanic grandparents. Then there was these 2 new legal classifications that were fictions, half Jews and quarter Jews. Doesn't make any sense. One guy says, being half Jewish is like being half circumcised. It's absurd. But the Nazis said anybody who had 2 Jewish grandparents, a Mischlinge ersten Grades, Mischlinge of the first degree, was a half Jew. And a person who had 1 Jewish grandparent was a Mischling of the zweiten Grades, or basically a quarter Jew. And what's interesting here is that for all the talk, Nazi talk, of the Jews being a race, the Nazis ultimately had to use religious criteria to define that race. They couldn't look at somebody and saying, hey, you're dark hair, you're flat foot, you're swarthy, you're a Jew. No. They had to go back and use religious criteria because that was the only way they could really document it. Shows you once again how bankrupt their racial science was at this time, but people had to take it very seriously. Now, what's interesting is when people ask me, okay, you've told me about the Nazi racial laws, you've told me, how some of these people, but how in the world did this happen by the numbers that you're giving us? Which I believe minimum 60,000 half Jews, 90,000 quarter Jews, and probably around 10,000 full Jews served in the German armed forces during World War II. How's that possible? I go into it in depth in my book through assimilation. But what's crazy is that the German draft laws of 1935 required every quarter Jew and half Jew to serve in the Wehrmacht. So think of the absurdity here. My mom, my grandma, my uncles, my cousins, they're all being persecuted, many of them having to wear the yellow star. And here I'm being drafted and have to serve in the German armed forces. Now, what's interesting is that they caused a lot of problems. So much so that in 1940, there were so many of these guys saying, stop messing with my family. I've served bravely in Poland, I've served bravely in France, and so on. Leave our families alone. Well, eventually this got to Hitler. Hitler said, we're either going to have to protect all the half-Jews who are in the German military and their families, or we're going to have to discharge the half-Jews. Well, we can't protect full Jews, their family members. Discharge the half-Jews. And Hitler started discharging them in late 1940, and those discharges continued to happen all throughout the war. There was almost 18 million men who went to the German armed forces during World War II. Think about the bureaucracy, the hard work doing genealogy on all their parents and grandparents. Hundreds of millions of people they had to document. doing this, because you had a lot of times go back to the great-grandparents to know who the grandparents were. It was a mess. Now, during this time, Hitler started giving exemptions. And there was 3 types of exemptions. One just allowed you to remain in the military. The other one allowed you to remain in the military and be promoted. These were called Genehmigungen, or special permissions. Then there were ones that allowed you to be declared of German blood. They were called Deutschblutigkeitserklärungen, or Arisierungen, Aryanizations. And Hitler, ladies and gentlemen, would sit at his desk and look at thousands of these applications. Now, when it was for these generals and admirals, you can maybe make an argument that that's valuable time because these guys are helping in the war effort. But most of the men who got these special clemencies, if you will, were common grunts, privates. I had this one document that was mind-numbing to me. At the height of the Battle of Stalingrad in December of 1942, Hitler reviews 30 guys under the rank of corporal, whether they were blonde enough or blue-eyed enough. He would look at photographs of them. Some of them nude to make sure, are they circumcised or not? Shows you just how obsessed he was, and that he was the highest authority of genetics in the land. It really gave an interesting insight into Hitler that, to my knowledge, no historian had actually seen before. And this is what's going on here, and this is how you got a lot of these guys serving. This is a typical picture of what Hitler liked. Side shot, front shot. This guy put in an application, and above it said, rejected, and it said, sieht zu jüdisch aus. He looks too Jewish. He committed suicide when he was in jail. Now, one question that is always asked of me when people look at this history is they say, okay, didn't these guys know about the Holocaust? And when I started this research, ladies and gentlemen, I thought overwhelmingly, yes, all of them knew about the Holocaust. How could they not know? On average, every man I documented lost around 7 relatives in the Shoah. But what I found was the opposite, that most of them did not know about it. Now, bear with me here. Yes, they knew about persecution. That it was not good to be a Jew. Yes, they knew about deportations, but where their relatives were being deported to was beyond their knowledge. Yes, they knew about some of the ghettos and some of the other problems going on during the Third Reich with the Kristallnacht and so on, but their imaginations did not allow them to think that the people they grew up with, teachers, policemen, officials, were actually systematically slaughtering their relatives. And this is what really convinced me of this argument. In 1944, Hitler had discharged a lot of half-Jews, tens of thousands of them. And things were going poorly. So Hitler said, we're going to use these half-Jews. So he set up these forced labor camps called Organisation Tod, OT forced labor camps. And he started to deport the half-Jews who had been dismissed from 41 to 44, who were at home, working, studying, and start sending them to camps. Now, if these men knew that their relatives who had been deported before them had been deported to their systematic extermination, why did most of these men, almost 99.9% of them, report to their own deportation stations? They would get notices quite often in the mail from the Arbeitsamt, the worker, office of the local, town, or the Gestapo. And they would show up. And only when they would go to these forced labor camps, which were very different than concentration camps and definitely very different than the death camps, only when they got there did they go, oh my God, now I am figuring out what's going on here. Luckily, most of the OT camps, they didn't get the wave of deportation there until the end of 44, beginning of 45. Most of the men survived. And here's an irony of irony. Most of the half-Jews that got dismissed right before the invasion of Russia. 80% of all Germans who died in World War II died in Russia. So the units that they trained with and so on basically got all slaughtered. So as a percentage-wise, the half-Jews survived as a higher percentage than their Aryan comrades who had the honor to go to Russia and get slaughtered. Now here's an interesting story I want to give you about the racial Nazi laws. This guy, Werner Goldberg, a good friend of mine, he was in the Berlin Senate. In 1939, he was in a unit that was asked, there was like 4 or 5 different units, battalions in the area of Berlin, that were asked by Goebbels to bring forward their most Aryan-looking German soldier. Werner Goldberg won the competition. And for the next 4 or 5 months, this white-haired, blue-eyed guy was thrown all over the media and so on as the typical Aryan soldier until they found out his father was a Jew. Once again, it just shows you the bankruptcy of Nazi racial laws. Now, to wrap up this talk, we've talked a lot about identity. I'd like to give you 2 stories that kind of highlight some of the problems I had while I was doing my research. The first guy I'd like to tell you about is Heinz Meyer. He was a journalist. And he had served many years in the Wehrmacht, was dismissed. At the end of the war, he was in an OT camp. He survived. After the war, he's like, you know what? I'm going to go to Israel. And I'm going to serve in the Israeli military. I'm going to do something for my Jewish family. So he goes down there, serves in the War of Independence. Later on, he becomes an officer. He's in the Sinai campaign in 1956. He's an officer. And he comes back to Tel Aviv. And the bureaucrats ask him to come into the office, get his ID papers in order. And so they're looking at his ID, and they're like, hey, tell us about your dad. Oh, my dad died in Auschwitz. How the heck did you serve in the German army? He told them how that happened. Okay, you were in the forced labor camp. What about your mother? Oh, my mother, well, she's a Christian. She's a Gentile. Oh, said the bureaucrat, you're not a Jew. It's like, wait a second. I lost my dad in Auschwitz. I was persecuted for being Jewish. I was sent to a camp. I'm now served 8 years in the Israeli military. I've been wounded 3 times. I'm in command of a company of tanks. And you're telling me I'm not Jewish? Well, I'm just telling you what's on the books. You can either prove that your mother's Jewish or you can convert to Judaism. He says, I'm an atheist. Well, we have a problem. He got so fed up with this, he went back to Germany. He said, maybe in a democratic country I can decide who I want to be. The next person I'd like to tell you about is Hamburger. Hamburger was a judge in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. I finished interviewing him, and I'm packing up my stuff, and his young girlfriend comes in and says, you should take the young man tonight. Hamburger tried to hush her up. He's like, no, she said. The young man would find it interesting. You should take him tonight. So I looked at Herr Hamburger and I said, what's going on tonight? He's like, well, the members of my unit, we get together once a month at a bar and we drink some beer and, we reminisce and so on. Would you like to go? He wasn't too enthusiastic about the question. I was like, yeah, that sounds interesting. I would like to go, Herr Hamburger. He's like, if you go, you got to promise me 2 things. First thing is, you can't tell anybody that I'm Jewish. For the last 60 years, I've kept it hidden. I like to keep it that way. It's like, okay, I won't tell anybody about your Jewish background. He's like, second of all, you can't tell them what you're studying because then they'll wonder why you came and talked to me. So tell them you're studying about the artillery tactics of the mountain troops because he was in a mountain division. I said, well, Herr Hamburger, I don't know too much about the artillery tactics of the mountain troops. How about I just tell them I'm studying the social dynamics of the Wehrmacht on the company level? He's like, yeah, that's good. It's like, okay, that's what I'll tell him. So a few hours later, I meet him at his house. We walk down to the bar. Everybody knows I'm coming. They're all excited. They're bringing their medals and so on. One guy brought his helmet that was shot through the top, and he had some scars on his skull, and he's showing the helmet. He's showing me the scars. Look at him, look at him. They're all excited to get their stories heard. But Hamburger's very nervous. He was basically lashed onto my right shoulder as if to prevent me from jumping up on this table. There was about 40 of them, so I wouldn't say, hey, he's Jewish. He's not supposed to be here. But eventually he saw I was being discreet, and he left me to my own devices, and I started working my way around the table. And I eventually came into conversation with the company commander, who was 92 years old, big brute of a guy, 6'4", about 220, great shape. I actually worked out with him a few days later at a local track. He said, hey, if you never stop using it, you won't lose it. Anyway, he had scars all down his hands. Just to give you a feel for this guy, he was taken prisoner by the Russians in 1942 after being knocked unconscious by a concussion grenade. And when he came to, he was in a Russian prisoner of war camp, and he was put on details to basically bury the German POWs that were dying in the camp. And what they would do is they would bring in all the heavy machinery in these big wooden crates, empty them, and then take the dead bodies, put them in the wooden crates, and then bury them. After a couple of weeks of this, he noticed that the Russian guards were not watching them very carefully, so he had his men bury him alive. And when he was sure the Russian guards were gone, he clawed through the wood, got out of the earth, made it back like 50 miles to his lines, and served 2.5 more years as an infantry officer. So this guy was pretty hardcore as I was talking to him, and I was able to verify this in his military file later on. He served 20 years in the Bundeswehr after the war. And as I was talking to him, I was like, Herr Rohr, Herr Hauptmann Rohr, I've come across an interesting story when I've been studying about the, company dynamics on the Wehrmacht level, about Jews and men of Jewish descent who served in the Nazi military. Have you ever heard about this? And he kind of looked at me in a shocked way. Then he looked over at me in a conspiratorial way and lowered his voice and said, "Don't tell Hamburger, but we know he's a Jew." I won't say anything. This is what's fascinating. Hamburger lost an eye. Hitler had said that any Mischling that suffered a severe wound was to be retroactively declared an Aryan to the date of his injury, but they had to have a company officer endorse him. Hamburger believed it was his battalion commander who wrote this letter, who died in combat later, that got him Aryanized, and when I went back to the files, Hamburger didn't know this till the day he died. Hauptmann Rohr had written him up for this. So think about the problem with anti-Semitism here. If he believed it so much, why did he put his name on a document to endorse his subordinate and get him protection? Just shows you how complicated the question of identity is. And so to end here, this is one thing I want to leave you with, ladies and gentlemen. Think about identity and what we're doing. What are important in life? Am I rich? Am I poor? Am I beautiful? Am I successful? Am I worthy to live? Am I worthy not to live? What questions are important? And I think it's very important to look at this because ultimately the way we come to define ourselves directly reflects how we understand history and, more importantly, how we treat others. And therein lies the wisdom. Thank you very much. I know I've run over, and I'm so sorry. That's a little bit of my ADHD and so on. So thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for your graciousness.
Thank you. Actually, Bryan, we have a few questions, and we have a few minutes for some questions that were just handed to me from the audience, and if you don't mind. One
Absolutely.
question with respect to your research. Were any of the soldiers that you spoke with and met with either raised Jewish or did they practice Judaism? And did any of them return to Judaism after the war?
Very good question. Many of the men that I documented, they were not raised really with anything. If they had something, they had a little Christian background because like Heinrich Heine said, the best way to get into Western civilization, to get your ticket punched, is to convert. And so that's what a lot of the families were doing. But quite often when they had contact with their grandparents and so on, they had a lot of experiences of experiencing the Jewish holidays, of going to the prayers and synagogues with grandpa and so on. So a lot of them had that connection. Quickly with the Nazi Reich, they kind of hushed it down, but this is what's interesting. After the war, many of them developed a strong Jewish identity, and it was born from persecution. And they wanted to know what this was all about. In fact, I can give you 3 publishing houses that deal with German Jewish history and Holocaust studies that are all developed by these half-Jews. There was several organizations that were trying to do Christian-Jewish understanding. Half-Jewish soldiers, once again. Werner Goldberg was a big one in Berlin. Because he's like, hey, when the church preaches that we're Jesus killers and saying that we are going to hell, this doesn't help us. And we see how dangerous this was because it ends in the ovens of Auschwitz. And so many of these guys did an awful lot of that. And this is what's interesting. Thank you for bringing this up, David. I documented 30 guys who went to Israel and served in the Israeli military for the independence in the Sinai campaign. When I went in 2005 and my book was translated with Matar, the guy Mr. Matar's, he had a cousin that was in the finance department of the Israeli government. And he just did some digging, and they came forward to me, and in 2005, there was still 120 men in Israel getting a Wehrmacht pension. 120. And I only knew of 5. So.
Amazing. Well, speaking of Israel, you mentioned earlier that you actually served in the Israeli army and the IDF. What inspired you to do that? How did that come about?
I wanted to know more about my Jewish background. And I wanted to embrace this part of my family that was cut off because my ancestors were embarrassed by it. You know, like John Kerry finding out about her, Madame Albright, even, Elvis had a Jewish background. So, I mean, this is a story of America, but I wanted to learn more about it. So I got one extreme when I was with the yeshiva world, yeshiva bochas, at Or Sameach. I wanted to get the other extreme and see, about what it means to serve a nation, learn the language of my ancestors, Hebrew, see if I was physically fit to do it. And, with my ADHD, I just got to do adventurous stuff, so that's why I did it.
Fabulous. Last question. Your newest book, Flamethrower, what inspired you to write that story?
So Flamethrower is my newest book with World War II. It's a very interesting story, and there's a huge Jewish theme in there. If you guys do not know Rabbi Gittleson, please look him up tonight and see the purest democracy of what he wrote. If all Americans could read that tonight with all our problems, it might help us shift our compass heading. This guy was brilliant, one of the most brilliant rabbis, one of the most famous chaplains of World War II, and I bring him into the book as a cornerstone because he gave the keynote talk at the 5th Marine Corps Cemetery. And this is what's interesting. So I'll get to your question very quick. Let me brag a little bit about Rabbi Gittleson, because there's a huge Jewish theme in there. One of the Medal of Honor recipients from Iwo Jima, Corporal Stein, a Jew. I was the first one to document his Jewish background. And then I have a lot of other Jewish guys in there that I found, and of course I have a prejudice for it to some degree. Rabbi Gittleson was a pacifist. He hated war. He was telling America not to go to war. And then suddenly he started realizing, pacifism doesn't work. If we do pacifism, we get the thugs of the world taking over places like Mussolini and Hitler. So he decided to serve. And what does he become? He becomes the first chaplain attached to the Marine Corps ever, Jewish chaplain. And so he's on Iwo Jima during the whole battle taking care of guys. This little Jewish guy, 5'5", scholar in his 30s, but he wants to make a difference. Now this is what brings tears to your eyes, but on the other side, it's just like serendipity and fate. So he is the most well-spoken, most educated of all the chaplains. But because of his being attached to the Marine Corps and the way that he is, he's second in command of all the chaplains, which makes all the priests and the preachers very upset. And the head of the chaplaincy of all the amphibious corps liked him. So when the war was over and there was supposed to be dedication, he picks Gittleson, not only because he's second in command, but also he's the most eloquent. Well, all the priests say this guy killed Christ. He's going to hell. We're going to boycott it and tell all the Catholic boys not to go there. And half of the Protestant ministers unfortunately said the same thing. And I'm thinking to myself, isn't this why we're fighting this war against Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, against fascism? Where's the freedom of religion? Where's the freedom of speech? Well, the head chaplain says, I'm not going to listen to him. You're going to speak. The rabbi, being the gracious man he was, said, hey, I'll tell you this, Bob, let me just have a separate Jewish ceremony at the cemetery, and I'll dedicate it for the Jews, and then let the priests dedicate it for the Catholics, and let the preachers do it for the Protestants, and then we'll all be there, but just put me over in the corner. I don't want any trouble, and let's commemorate the real heroes in this this graveyard. And he writes, this purest democracy will make your hair on the back of your neck stand up, about saying when you look over this cemetery, which you see Jewish stars, you see Christian crosses. He says there's Negroes, as they used the term back then, African Americans, there's Catholics, Protestants. They don't care about who's next to them. It's the purest democracy. And talking about what they were fighting for. It brings tears to your eyes. Now, this is what's interesting. A couple of the preachers, the Protestant preachers, were so disgusted with their Catholic priest cohorts and the other preachers that they boycotted their ceremonies and attended Gittleson. And they were so taken with his talk that they went up and said, can we read that and have it? And Rabbi Gittleson, yeah, sure. They went to the beach and went to the facsimile machines and started making copies. And before you knew it, every man who left that island got a copy of it. Suddenly, they're sending it home to mom and dad. Suddenly, mom and dad are reading, going, this is good stuff. They're giving it to CBS, NBC radio. 3 years later, he becomes an overnight sensation. So from an act of bigotry, he becomes one of the most famous chaplains of World War II. And he's the first rabbi on the Interfaith Council under President Truman. And he becomes remarkable. He's amazing. He brings tears to your eyes. So what was the inspiration of doing this? That's one inspiration. When I went to Iwo Jima for the 70th commemoration in 2015 with my 12-year-old son to just touch Mecca as a Marine Corps officer, you think Jews are tight? Go to the Marine Corps. It's a whole new tribe. And I wanted to go there, teach my son, freedom is not free. I hope you serve. These are men that are very young. They dedicated their lives. And while I'm running around there, I'm having him read Gitelson's speech, and then we give it to the top monument there. While I'm there, I meet Woody Williams, the last Medal of Honor recipient from the Marine Corps from World War II. He just died at 98. In July of this year, he was in the rotunda in our Capitol. Never has happened for an enlisted man ever in the history of America. I'm on the island with him, and I find out nobody has ever interviewed him and really written up his story, and he's never written up his story. And one of his favorite friends was Philip Cohen. And he never knew a Jew. He thought they had horns. He literally thought they had horns. You hear about this story, but I heard it from Woody. I'm like, God, man, thank God we've come a long ways. We've still got a lot longer to go. But anyway, so I hear about Woody, start documenting his life, and I start finding out that he's a borderline stolen valor. He shouldn't have gotten the Medal of Honor. But I use his life to tell like the band of brothers of the Marine Corps at Iwo Jima. And I did a deep dive of 5 years. I went through 18 archives in China, Japan, Guam, America, and Germany to document the story. And I think it's the most, if you've had any family members over in the Pacific, or if you've had anybody in the Navy or Marine Corps, I think you would like this book. And it kind of tells you the Jewish theme of the Marines, also of World War II. And that was kind of the genesis of meeting this guy on this island, wanting to honor Rabbi Gitelson, who's one of my heroes now, and to tell the story once again that freedom is not free. To put this in context, we lost 7,000 boys in 30 days on Iwo Jima. We lost more American boys there than all death in the last 30 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. Think of the mothers and grandmothers and grandfathers, fathers affected. We should never forget that we have women and men in this room. Your heads are not covered. We have different religions. We have a lot of problems, but boy, we have so much to be grateful for. And it's because of these people who have fought against horrible regimes like Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. And then we bring them democracy. And this is an amazing testament to how to be proud to be American. So that's another reason why I wrote it.
Well, Bryan, thank you. And with Veterans Day approaching tomorrow, again, thank you for your service and for all of our veterans. We are so grateful for everything that you've done for us. So this concludes our program, ladies and gentlemen. We have a reception to follow in Wolf Tumum Hall. Bryan will be there as well to share more with you and to answer any of your questions. He also has brought some books with him, so if there are books that you are particularly interested in from his collection, you're more than welcome to have a copy as a gift from the congregation. He'll sign them as well, and they're first come, first served. So thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you. It's great.